The moment Nolan's cryopod slid open, and he fell to the floor gasping, the war to take back the Arcturus was already over. Klaxon alarms blared, red emergency lights flashed. The stench of melted circuitry and spilled cryo fluid choked the air, and everywhere Nolan looked, the colony ship's cryo bay lay in ruin. It hadn't always been this way. When the Arcturus first launched from Earth all those centuries ago, she had been a shining beacon of humanity's future. Her hull gleamed, her fusion drives hummed with power, and nestled safely inside her cryopods slept 10,000 human colonists, dreaming of the new world that awaited them. But then came the Ledosians, savage locust-like aliens that stripped the Arcturus like hungry piranhas tearing meat from bone. Viewing the slumbering humans as worthless, the Ledosian warrior queen Spicer and her drones ravaged the ship, plundering its weapons, engines, and supplies before abandoning it as a lifeless husk, drifting aimlessly through the void. Now, as Nolan staggers to his feet, he sees the aftermath of the aliens' ruthless carnage, sparking control panels, smashed equipment, and worst of all, row after row of malfunctioning cryopods, their inhabitants still trapped in endless slumber, oblivious to the danger. But Nolan knows the truth. The ship is crippled, stranded in an uncharted galaxy, utterly vulnerable, and if he can't find a way to revive his fellow humans and get the Arcturus running again, they'll all die out here, alone, forgotten. Just one man standing against the pitiless void of space. The war to reclaim the Arcturus begins now, and there can be no surrender, no retreat. For if the humans of the Arcturus fail, it will mean the end. Not just for them, but for the dream of a human future among the stars. That's when he saw it. The pod's life support systems were shutting down one by one. He frantically checked the others. All the same, some insidious force was killing his crewmates as they slept. Nolan's blood ran cold. The Ledosians, those alien bastards, must have left something behind. A final fuck you to humanity. He raced to the computer core, praying he wasn't too late. The corridors stretched forever, emergency lights flickering like a strobe. Nolan's skin crawled, swore something skittered in the vents. Watching, waiting. The core pulsed with sickly green light. Nolan recoiled. Tendrils of something alien snaked through the circuits, the ship's very veins. A virus. Nolan steadied himself. His marine training would have to be enough. He was no computer expert, but he'd be damned if he'd let his crew die like this. Klaxons blared as the first pods failed, voices crying out pitifully weak before falling silent. Nolan worked feverishly, trying to isolate the virus's code. Sweat soaked his back. But it wasn't enough. One by one the pods winked out. 1,000 lives extinguished with each passing second. The shuttle, he could still escape, save himself. The temptation sang to him. He could... No? Nolan slammed his fist on the console. He wouldn't abandon them. Even if it killed him, he had to try. He dove back in, hunting, searching for some vulnerability in the virus's armor. All around the ship grew quieter, stiller, as though it too was succumbing. An airless tomb. But Nolan refused to surrender. Failure was not an option. Not while one cryopod still showed signs of life. He'd beat this virus, or he'd die trying. Nolan's fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code flashing before his eyes. The ship's systems were labyrinthine, a tangled web of subroutines and hidden protocols. But he refused to give up, digging deeper and deeper, searching for any clue that could help him defeat the insidious virus. Hours passed, maybe days, time losing all meaning in the cold, dark tomb of the Arcturus. Nolan's eyes burned, his body ached, but still he pressed on. And then, buried deep within a forgotten data cache, he found it. A message from the ship's former captain, recorded in the chaotic final moments before the Ledosians boarded. Nolan's heart raced as the captain's haggard face filled the screen. "If you're seeing this, it means the Ledosians have taken the ship," the captain said, his voice trembling. "But there's something you need to know. The virus, it's not just meant to kill us. It's designed to turn us into slaves." Nolan's blood ran cold as the captain explained the true nature of the attack. The colonists had been carefully chosen, each one possessing unique skills and abilities that the Ledosians coveted. The virus would strip away their free will, leaving behind only obedient drones ready to serve their new alien masters. There might be a way to stop it, the captain continued, his image flickering. But it won't be easy. You'll have to go to the reactor core, find the main control hub. If you can shut it down, it might purge the virus from the system. But be careful. The core is heavily shielded, and if the containment fails... The message cut off abruptly, leaving Nolan in stunned silence. The reactor core. Of course, it was the most heavily protected part of the ship, the one place the virus might not have reached. Nolan grabbed his weapon and headed for the door, his mind racing. The journey to the core would be treacherous, the corridors dark and filled with unknown dangers. But what choice did he have? As he stepped out into the hallway, a sudden skittering sound made him freeze. It echoed through the vents above, a dry, rasping noise that sent shivers down his spine. Nolan raised his weapon, his heart pounding. Shambling out of the shadows, their bodies twisted and deformed, came the infected colonists. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, their mouths twisted into snarls. They had once been human, but now they were something else entirely, their minds consumed by the virus's relentless programming. Nolan fired, the shots echoing through the corridor. The creatures stumbled but kept coming, their movements jerky and unnatural. He turned and ran, their howls and screeches echoing behind him. The race was on, a desperate sprint through the darkened ship, the infected colonists in hot pursuit. Nolan's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he pushed himself harder, faster. He had to reach the reactor core, had to find a way to stop the virus before it was too late. But even as he ran, a sinking feeling grew in the pit of his stomach. How many of the colonists had already been transformed? How many more would fall before he could find a way to save them? There was no time to think, no time to plan. Nolan could only keep moving, keep fighting, keep hoping that somehow, some way, he would find a way to save the Arcturus and the thousands of lives that depended on him. Nolan burst into the reactor core, the massive chamber thrumming with raw, pulsating energy. Pipes and conduits snaked along the walls, the machinery's deafening hum assaulting his ears. He spotted the main control hub, its panels glowing an eerie green. This was it, the ship's salvation or its doom. Nolan approached the console, his heart pounding. The captain's dire warning echoed in his mind. Initiating the reactor meltdown would flood the ship with virus-purging radiation, but it would also be signing his own death warrant. His fingers hovered over the keypad, one command and it would all be over, but then... A guttural snarl shattered the air. Nolan whirled, dread clutching his chest. There, emerging from the shadows, lurched a grotesque figure. Tattered remnants of a crewman's uniform hung from its twisted, mutated frame. Sickly green eyes burned with feral hunger. The Ledosian virus, it had claimed another victim. "No," Nolan whispered, his blood running cold. The creature lunged, razor claws slashing. Nolan leapt aside, the talons screeching across his suit. Warning lights flared in his helmet display, suit integrity compromised. No time, he had to end this now. Nolan launched himself at the creature, a lifetime of marine training guiding his movements. They crashed against the reactor housing, a tangle of thrashing limbs and gnashing teeth. Claws raked Nolan's armor. Alarms blared. His oxygen supply plummeted. With a roar of desperation, Nolan drove his fist into the creature's face, bone crunching. It reeled back, howling. Nolan lunged for the control panel. His fingers flew across the keys, overriding safety protocols. The reactor's hum crescendoed to a scream. Meltdown initiated, radiation levels spiking. The chamber blazed with blinding light, searing heat. Nolan staggered back, shielding his eyes. He had to get out. Now. But the creature surged forward, a mass of tooth and claw. Nolan grappled with it, the seconds ticking down. With a final Herculean effort, he hurled the abomination aside and sprinted for the exit. The reactor detonated. An apocalyptic shockwave slammed into Nolan, hurling him into the corridor. He skidded to a halt, his suit smoking, alarms shrieking. Behind him, the reactor core blazed like the heart of a newborn sun. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of coolant and the rasp of Nolan's labored breathing. He staggered to his feet, his head swimming. He had to check, had to be sure. The computer terminal flickered to life at his touch. Diagnostics scrolled past, the data resolving into a single beautiful truth. The virus was gone, purged from the Arcturus's systems, and the cryopods. Nolan nearly wept as one by one, the pod status lights winked from red to green. But then Nolan saw the readout on his own suit's medical display. Radiation levels off the charts. His armor had been breached. Even now he could feel the sickness beginning to ravage his body. Nolan slumped against the wall, his vision blurring. He'd given everything to save the Arcturus, and now it would cost him his life. Nolan fought through the haze of pain, each step an agony as he staggered back to the cryo chamber. His breath came in ragged gasps, the radiation sickness ravaging his body. He had to get to the pods, had to save who he could. The chamber was a graveyard of shattered dreams. Pods lay dark and lifeless, their occupants forever lost to the void. But there, a flicker of hope. A handful of status lights still glowed green. With trembling fingers, Nolan initiated the revival sequence. The pods hissed open, groggy colonists stumbling forth. Among them, a woman with fierce, intelligent eyes, Dr. Eliza Novak, the Arcturus's chief medical officer. What happened? Eliza asked, her voice hoarse from centuries of disuse. Then her gaze fell on Nolan, taking in his haggard appearance, the ugly radiation burns marring his skin. My God, you need help, now. Nolan shook his head, even that small motion sending spikes of agony through his skull. No time, he rasped. The ship. We have to... We will, she said firmly. But first we need to get you stable. The medbay... Eliza's jaw tightened. Then we improvise. There has to be something left. Supplies, equipment... Together they searched the ship, picking through the ruins of their former lives. Every step was a battle for Nolan, the radiation eating him alive from the inside out. His vision swam, dark spots dancing before his eyes, but he pushed on, driven by sheer force of will. As they scavenged, a sound echoed through the corridors, a skittering, clattering noise that raised the hairs on Nolan's neck. He exchanged a glance with Eliza, saw his own dread mirrored in her eyes. The mutated ones, he said hoarsely. Some survived. From that moment, every shadow became a threat, every echoing footfall a harbinger of horror. They moved as quickly as Nolan's failing body allowed, hearts pounding, expecting an attack at any moment. The medbay was a ruin, equipment smashed, supplies scattered. But Eliza was resourceful, her hands moving with practiced surety as she gathered what she could. Saline bags, painkillers, a battered diagnostic scanner. She worked with grim focus, hooking Nolan up to a makeshift IV, injecting him with what meager medications she had scrounged. But even as she labored to save him, the truth hung unspoken between them. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Nolan needed intensive treatment, facilities far beyond what the crippled Arcturus could provide, and with the ship dead in space, no help coming. Eliza met his gaze, her eyes filled with a grief she couldn't quite hide. This will buy you time, she said softly, but not much. We need to find a way off this ship, get you to a real medical facility. Nolan nodded weakly, the simple motion sending fresh waves of agony crashing through him. But even through the pain, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. They were stranded, hunted, and unless they found a way out, the void of space would be their grave. In the desolate stillness of the medbay, Eliza labored over Nolan's prone form, his breath coming in shallow rasps. The makeshift IV dripped a meager ration of painkillers into his system, but it was a paltry defense against the ravages of radiation sickness. Even as Nolan drifted in and out of consciousness, The other survivors worked tirelessly to restore power to the Arcturus. Sparks flew as they spliced frayed wires, their hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. Every flickering light, every sputtering console was a hard-fought victory. But their efforts were hampered at every turn. The damage was extensive, the ship's systems crippled by the Lodosian attack, and with each passing hour, the spectre of the mutated crewmates loomed larger, their eerie skittering echoing through the darkened corridors. It was Nolan who found it first. Hunched over a gutted control panel, his head swimming with fever dreams, his fingers brushed against something unexpected. A transmitter, miraculously intact amidst the wreckage of an escape pod. "We could send a signal," he rasped, holding the device aloft with shaking hands. "Call for help." Eliza frowned, her brow furrowed with concern. "But who would hear us out here? And what if the Lodosians are listening?" Nolan met her gaze, his eyes burning with desperate determination. "We have to try. It's our only chance." The debate raged for hours, the survivors huddled in the medbay, their voices rising and falling in a tense symphony. Some pleaded for caution, insisting that they should conserve their resources, wait for a better opportunity. Others demanded action, their fear boiling over into anger. Through it all, Nolan struggled to keep the peace, his words slurring as the fever took hold. The radiation was a constant agony, a fire in his veins that no medicine could quench. But even as his body failed, his mind raced with fragments of memory, snippets of the strange dreams that haunted his fitful sleep. Visions of the Lodosians, their chitinous bodies pulsing with an eerie green light, whispers of a secret buried deep within the Arcturus's mission, a truth that could shatter the very foundations of their world. But before Nolan could make sense of the fragments, a scream tore through the medbay. One of the survivors, a young woman named Jenna, stood trembling before an open cryopod, her face a mask of horror. Nolan forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming as he stumbled to her side. And there, nestled within the pod's icy embrace, lay a nightmare made flesh. It was a Lodosian, its carapace glistening with frost, its compound eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. But even in death, the creature exuded an aura of malevolence, a palpable sense of wrongness that set Nolan's teeth on edge. Nolan exchanged a glance with Eliza, a silent communication passing between them. They both knew what this meant. The Lodosians had planned for every contingency, had seeded their agent among the colonists like a ticking time bomb. And now, as the survivors struggled to hold on to their sanity in the face of unimaginable horror, the true scope of the enemy's plan was beginning to unfold. The Arcturus was more than just a colony ship. It was a pawn in a game of galactic chess, a move calculated with ruthless precision. Nolan gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening even as his body betrayed him. He would not let the Lodosians win, not after all he had sacrificed, all he had endured. He turned to Eliza, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to find out what it knows, what it was planning." She nodded grimly, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination. "And then we need to send that signal. We can't let this ship become our tomb." As the survivors rallied around them, their faces etched with a grim resolve, Nolan felt a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. They were broken, battered, but not beaten. Not yet. And as long as they had breath in their bodies, they would fight, for their lives, for their future. For the dream of a humanity that would not be extinguished. Nolan's grip tightened on his weapon as he and Eliza stepped into the medbay, the lights flickering ominously overhead. There, standing before them, was the Lodosian infiltrator they had discovered in the cryopod. Its chitinous exoskeleton gleamed a sickly green in the emergency lighting, compound eyes glittering with malevolent intelligence. "Zortex," Nolan growled, his voice rough with exhaustion and pain. "That's what you call yourself, isn't it?" The creature's mandibles clicked in what might have been a laugh. "Very astute, human. I see my reputation precedes me." Eliza stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "What do you want from us? Why infiltrate the Arcturus?" Zortex's eyes narrowed, its voice dripping with contempt. "Want? We Ledosians want nothing from you pitiful creatures. We have been watching your kind for centuries, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." A chill ran down Nolan's spine at the creature's words. "What do you mean?" "The Arcturus was no mere colony ship," Zortex hissed. "It was a trap designed to lure the best and brightest of your species into a vulnerable position, and now, thanks to your foolish trust, we have you exactly where we want you." Nolan shook his head, refusing to believe the infiltrator's taunts. "You're lying. Earth would never have fallen to the likes of you." Zortex's laughter echoed through the medbay, a grating, inhuman sound. "Earth! Your homeworld is nothing more than a smouldering ruin. The Arcturus is all that remains of your pathetic civilization." The Ledosian merely laughed again, its hand moving to a device on its wrist. "I don't think so, human. I have a far better idea." Suddenly the ship shuddered violently, explosions rocking the corridors. Alarms blared, red lights flashing in warning. "What have you done?" Eliza cried, her eyes wide with horror. Zortex's mandibles twisted in a cruel smile. "I've initiated the ship's self-destruct sequence. In a matter of minutes the reactor will overload, and the Arcturus will be nothing more than a cloud of debris." Chaos erupted around them as the survivors, alerted by the alarms, began to scramble for the escape pods. But Nolan and Eliza stood their ground, knowing they had to stop Zortex and the reactor meltdown, no matter the cost. They charged at the infiltrator, weapons firing, dodging the debris that rained down around them as the ship tore itself apart. Zortex was fast, inhumanly so, its exoskeleton deflecting their shots with ease. It lashed out with razor-sharp claws, scoring deep gashes in the walls as Nolan and Eliza ducked and weaved. The medbay became a battlefield, sparks flying, metal screeching as it buckled under the strain. In a desperate gambit, Eliza lunged at Zortex, grappling with the creature, trying to force it back into a damaged section of the ship. The Ledosian hissed and thrashed, its strength incredible, but Eliza held on, gritting her teeth against the pain. With a final Herculean effort, she shoved Zortex through the buckled bulkhead, the metal ceiling behind it trapping the infiltrator. But not before Zortex's claws found their mark, tearing through Eliza's suit, blood blooming in the torn fabric. "Go," Eliza whispered, her hand gripping his. "Nolan, you have to stop the reactor. Leave me." Tears stung Nolan's eyes. "No, I can't, not after everything." "You must." Her voice was fading, her eyes struggling to focus. "It's the only way." With an anguished cry, Nolan forced himself to his feet to turn away from Eliza's broken form. He ran, his lungs burning, his heart shattering with every step, racing against the countdown to oblivion. The reactor control room was a maelstrom of flashing lights and blaring warnings. Nolan's hands flew over the console, his mind racing, seeking the shutdown sequence that would stop the meltdown. Seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. The ship groaned and shuddered around him, the metal screaming its death throes. Just as the reactor reached critical mass, Nolan's fingers found the right controls, inputting the emergency override. The reactor powered down with a shuddering whine, the ship falling dark and silent. Nolan collapsed against the console, his body racked with exhaustion and grief, the weight of all he had lost crashing down upon him. But even as he struggled to catch his breath, a blinding light filled the viewport, washing over the battered husk of the Arcturus. Nolan squinted against the glare, his heart seizing in his chest as he realized what he was seeing. A massive Ledosian warship loomed before him, drawn by the Arcturus's distress signal, like a predator to wounded prey. And as Nolan stared into that pitiless light, he knew that his fight for survival, for the future of humanity itself, was far from over. As the blinding light of the Ledosian warship flooded the Arcturus's viewport, Nolan felt a cold dread grip his heart. The darkness took him then, a yawning void that swallowed his consciousness whole. He awoke with a start, his body held fast by pulsing organic restraints that seemed to grow from the very walls of his prison. The chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen, a nightmarish fusion of biology and technology that pulsed with a sickly green light. Nolan struggled against his bonds, his muscles screaming in protest, but it was no use. He was trapped, a fly caught in the web of some monstrous spider. The door to the chamber slid open with a hiss, revealing a group of Ledosians, their chitinous exoskeletons glinting in the eerie light. At their head stood a towering figure, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. "I am Overlord Zarkon," the creature said, its voice a grating metallic rasp. "And you, human, are now my prisoner." Zarkon stepped closer, his clawed fingers tracing the air just inches from Nolan's face. "Your kind has been a thorn in our side for far too long," he hissed. "But no more. We have been studying you, learning your weaknesses, preparing for this moment." Nolan's mind reeled. The Ledosians had been experimenting on humans for how long, to what end? "The Arcturus was to be our crowning achievement," Zarkon continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "A ship full of prime specimens, ripe for the taking, but you have thrown our plans into chaos." "Tell me where the other survivors are," Zarkon demanded, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Surrender them to me, and I promise you a swift and painless death." The Overlord's eyes narrowed, his mandibles twitching with barely contained rage. "We shall see," he hissed. "We have ways of making you talk, human, ways of breaking even the strongest will." With a gesture, Zarkon summoned his underlings forward, their clawed hands brandishing strange alien devices that pulsed with an ominous energy. Pain, white-hot and searing, lanced through Nolan's body as the devices made contact with his skin. He screamed, his voice echoing off the organic walls of the chamber, but Zarkon only looked on impassively. "Where are the survivors?" he demanded again, his voice cutting through the haze of agony. "What secrets does the Arcturus hold?" But Nolan gritted his teeth, refusing to yield. He would endure this and worse before he betrayed his crewmates. As the torture continued, Nolan's grip on reality began to fray. The lines between the real and the imagined blurred, and he found himself slipping into vivid, hallucinatory dreams. He saw Eliza. Her face hardened with determination as she led the survivors in a desperate battle against the Ledosians. He saw the corridors of the Arcturus, twisted and changed, pulsing with the same sickly light as his prison. And he saw something else, a glimpse of an object, ancient and alien, hidden in the deepest recesses of the ship, an artifact of immense power whispered of in the oldest legends of the cosmos. Nolan knew with a certainty that defied logic that this artifact was the key to defeating the Ledosians, to saving his crew, and perhaps to the very fate of humanity itself. But to claim it, he would have to escape this hellish place. He would have to endure the Overlord's torments, navigate the twisted labyrinth of the Ledosian ship, and find a way, any way, to contact Eliza and the others. It was a task that seemed impossible, a gauntlet of pain and madness designed to break him, body and soul. But Nolan was a Marine, a warrior, and he could not fail. Even if it cost him everything, even if it cost him his very sanity. Nolan's breath came in ragged gasps as he twisted against his organic bonds, the pulsating restraints cutting into his flesh. Overlord Zarkon's mocking laughter echoed in his ears, mingling with the searing pain of the mind probe's invasive tendrils. But even through the haze of agony, Nolan refused to break. He focused his thoughts, channeling the iron will that had seen him through countless battles. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he wrenched his arms free, the restraints tearing away in a spray of viscous fluid. The Ledosian guards chittered in alarm, their compound eyes widening in shock. They lunged for Nolan, razor-tipped claws outstretched, but he was already moving. Years of marine training took over as he dove beneath their grasping talons, his hands finding the pressure points in their chitinous exoskeletons with practiced ease. The guards crumpled, twitching spasmodically. Nolan snatched up one of their fallen plasma rifles and sprinted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The corridor beyond was a nightmare of twisting organic passageways, pulsing with the same sickly light as his prison. Strange gurgling noises echoed from the shadows, setting his teeth on edge. He picked a direction at random and ran, his bare feet slapping against the spongy floor. Alarm shrieked, the ship itself seeming to shudder with rage at his escape. Nolan ducked and wove, plasma bolts sizzling past his head as security drones swarmed out of hidden alcoves. A sudden wrenching pain doubled him over, his vision swimming. The hallucinations were getting worse, phantom images flickering at the edges of his sight. He saw Eliza, her face contorted in anguish, reaching out to him across an impossible void. Saw the twisted, mutated forms of his former crewmates, their eyes burning with accusation. Nolan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to push through the pain and disorientation. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Not with so much at stake. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, his breath catching in his throat. There, set into the pulsing wall, was a massive, puckered sphincter, and through its translucent membrane he could see the huddled forms of human captives, their faces gaunt and haunted. Nolan approached cautiously, his weapon at the ready. The captives shrank back, their eyes wide with fear and despair, all except one, a grizzled, battle-scarred man who met Nolan's gaze with a defiant glare. "It's about damn time someone showed up," the man growled, his voice rough with disuse. "Name's Raven, been fighting these Ladosian bastards for longer than I care to remember." Nolan felt a surge of hope. Another human. Another ally in this nightmare. "Nolan Gage, USSMC," he said, offering a hand. "I need your help, Raven. We need to get a message to my ship, the Arcturus. They have something the Ladosians want, something that could turn the tide of this war." Raven's eyes narrowed. "The Nexus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been searching for it for years. If your people have it—" "They do," Nolan said grimly, "but they don't know its true power. We have to tell them, have to get them to bring it here." Raven nodded, a fierce light kindling in his eyes. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's hijack that communication array and give the Ladosians a wake-up call they won't soon forget." Together they set off into the labyrinthine depths of the ship, Nolan's heart pounding with renewed determination. The Nexus was real, and with its power they might just have a chance to save not only the Arcturus, but the future of humanity itself. But first, they would have to face the most heavily guarded part of the ship, and the terrifying power of Overlord Zarkon himself. As they ventured deeper into the bowels of the alien vessel, the hallucinations intensified. Ghostly apparitions leered from the shadows, their forms twisted and grotesque. Nolan saw the faces of his fallen comrades, their features contorted in silent screams. He saw the ruined husk of Earth, its cities reduced to ash and rubble. "Focus, Marine," Raven growled, his voice cutting through the nightmarish visions. "We're almost there." Nolan blinked, shaking his head to clear the cobwebs. Ahead, the corridor opened into a vast, cavernous chamber, and there, at its center, stood the communication array, a towering spire of pulsating organic circuitry. But between them and their goal, a legion of Ladosian warriors stood at the ready, their weapons trained on the intruders. And at their head, his eyes blazing with malevolent fury, was Overlord Zarkon himself. "Did you really think you could escape me, human?" Zarkon hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your mind belongs to me now. Your secrets, your hopes, your fears, all laid bare before the might of the Ladosian Dominion." Nolan felt a surge of white-hot anger. He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You want to see inside my mind, Zarkon?" he snarled. "Then take a good long look, because all you'll find there is the burning desire to see you and your kind wiped from the face of the galaxy." With a roar of defiance, Nolan opened fire, the plasma bolt searing through the air. Beside him, Raven unleashed a barrage of his own, his aim deadly and precise. The Ladosians scattered, their formation broken by the sudden onslaught. Zarkon bellowed in rage, his claws slashing at the air. He lunged at Nolan, moving with blinding speed, but Nolan was ready. He sidestepped the attack, his rifle butt smashing into Zarkon's skull with a sickening crunch. The Overlord staggered, black ichor oozing from the crack in his exoskeleton, but he did not fall. With a howl of fury, he launched himself at Nolan again, his claws tearing into the Marine's flesh. Pain exploded through Nolan's body, but he refused to yield. He grappled with Zarkon, the two of them locked in a deadly embrace. They crashed against the communication array, sparks flying, circuitry shattering. Nolan's vision blurred, the edges of reality fraying. He saw the Arcturus adrift and helpless, saw Eliza and the survivors, their faces etched with despair. And he saw the Nexus, glowing with an otherworldly light, the key to their salvation. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Nolan wrenched himself free of Zarkon's grasp. His hand closed around a jagged shard of the shattered array, and he plunged it deep into the Overlord's eye. Nolan staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him the Ledosians were in disarray, their hive mind thrown into chaos by the death of their leader. Raven was at the communication array, his fingers flying over the controls. "I'm sending the message," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "Pray to whatever gods you believe in that your people get it in time." Nolan nodded, his heart pounding. He looked out at the stars, at the infinite expanse of space. Somewhere out there, the Arcturus drifted, carrying with it the last hope of humanity. And now that hope rested on the strength and courage of a handful of survivors, bound together by the unbreakable bonds of desperation and defiance. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Nolan plunged the jagged shard of metal deep into the communication array's control panel. Sparks flew, the acrid stench of melted circuitry filling the air as he input the sequence that would send his message to the Arcturus. Behind him, Overlord Zarkon roared in fury, his razor-sharp claws slashing through the air. Nolan barely managed to dodge the blow, rolling to the side as the Ledosian's talons gouged deep furrows in the deck plating. But even as he moved, he felt a searing pain lance through his chest. He looked down, his eyes widening in shock, as he saw the glistening point of Zarkon's claw protruding from his chest, slick with his own blood. The world seemed to tilt, his vision blurring at the edges. Nolan slumped to the ground, his life force ebbing away with each ragged breath. But even as the darkness closed in, he saw the communication array flare to life, his message streaking out into the void. He had done it. The Arcturus would know what to do. They would bring the Nexus, use its power to defeat the Ledosians once and for all. As his eyes drifted shut, Nolan saw a vision of Eliza, her face etched with grief and determination as she rallied the survivors. He saw them boarding the escape pods, Raven at the helm, his grizzled features set in a mask of grim resolve. With his last ounce of strength, Nolan reached out, his bloody fingers fumbling across the control panel. He had one final task, one last sacrifice to make. But it would give the others a chance to escape, to carry on the fight, and that was all that mattered. As the countdown began, Nolan let out a final rattling breath. His part in this war was over. But for Eliza, for Raven, for all the survivors of the Arcturus, the battle was just beginning. The escape pods hurtled through space, the Arcturus's survivors crammed into their cramped confines. Eliza stood at the forward viewport, her gaze fixed on the looming hull of the Ledosian ship. "Nolan's sacrifice won't be in vain," Raven growled, his hands flying across the controls. "We'll make those bastards pay for what they've done." Eliza nodded, her jaw set. The Nexus felt heavy in her hands, its alien energy thrumming through her veins. She knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that this was their only hope. The pod slammed into the Ledosian ship's hull, the impact throwing them hard against their restraints. Raven was the first to recover, kicking open the hatch and leaping out, his weapon at the ready. But as they made their way through the twisted corridors, following the path Nolan had laid out in his message, a grim realization began to dawn. The ship was too quiet, the resistance too light. Something was wrong. And then they found him, Nolan's body lay crumpled on the deck, his unseeing eyes staring up at the pulsing lights of the communication array. The jagged wound in his chest still oozed, a dark pool of blood spreading beneath him. Eliza's knees buckled, a strangled sob tearing from her throat. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing against Nolan's cold, still face. But there was no time for grief, no time for mourning. The ship shuddered around them, the self-destruct sequence ticking inexorably down. "Eliza," Raven's voice cut through the haze of her despair. "We have to go now." She nodded, tears streaking her face as she tore herself away from Nolan's body. The Nexus pulsed in her grip, its power calling to her, begging to be unleashed. They raced through the corridors, the surviving Ledosians throwing themselves at them in a frenzy of claws and gnashing teeth. But Eliza barely noticed them, her focus narrowed to a single, burning point. She reached the ship's central chamber, the Nexus held high above her head. The remaining Ledosians surged forward, their compound eyes glinting with madness and hunger. Eliza closed her eyes, reaching deep within herself to the well of grief and rage that burned in her heart. She thought of Nolan, of his courage and his sacrifice. She thought of the Arcturus, of all the lives lost and the dreams shattered. And then she let it all go. The Nexus erupted with blinding light, a maelstrom of psychic energy that tore through the Ledosians like a scythe. Their screams echoed through the chamber as they clutched at their heads, their minds shredding under the onslaught of human emotion. The ship convulsed, its very structure warping and buckling as the Ledosian's hive mind turned on itself. Consoles exploded, bulkheads collapsed, the air itself seeming to scream in agony. "Go!" Eliza yelled, her voice raw with effort. "Back to the pods!" They ran, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame, the ship disintegrating around them. They hurled themselves into the escape pods, Raven slamming the hatches shut just as the Ledosian vessel erupted in a blinding flash of light. The shockwaves slammed into the pods, sending them tumbling end over end through the void. Eliza clung to her restraints, the Nexus clutched tight against her chest as alarms blared and sparks rained down around her. And then, silence. The pods drifted in the void, the wreckage of the Ledosian ship spreading out in a glittering cloud behind them. They had won, but at what cost? The Arcturus was a ruin, its once gleaming corridors now dark and lifeless. The survivors huddled in the medbay, tending to their wounds, mourning their fallen comrades. Eliza moved among them, offering words of comfort, of encouragement. But inside she felt hollow, numb. Nolan was gone, sacrificing himself so that they might live. And so many others had fallen, their bodies consigned to the cold embrace of space. Earth under attack, Ledosians, all-out invasion. Eliza's blood ran cold, her heart seizing in her chest. They had won the battle, but the war, it seemed, was far from over. She turned to Raven, to the haggard, haunted faces of the survivors. "Set a course for Earth," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her gut. "We have a planet to save." The Arcturus engines flared to life, the ship lurching forward into the endless expanse of space. Eliza stood at the viewport, watching the stars streak by, the weight of the Nexus heavy in her hand. They were battered, broken, their numbers dwindled to a mere fraction of what they once were. But they were not beaten, not yet. For they carried with them the hopes and dreams of all who had come before, all who had fought and bled and died to keep the flame of humanity burning bright against the darkness. And as long as even one of them still drew breath, that flame would never be extinguished. The Arcturus vanished into the void, a tiny mote of light against the vast, uncaring cosmos. Eliza and her crew steeled themselves for the battles to come, their hearts heavy with loss, but alight with a fierce, unyielding determination. The war for Earth, for the very soul of humanity, was about to begin, and they would be there to meet it head-on, no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. For in the end, that was all they could do. Fight, endure, and hope that somehow, some way the dawn would come again. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.